It hadn't been long since Nate became the manager at the office, but he immediately decided to break the way of things there. The first thing he did was cut the salaries, of course, bypassing his own. As greedy as he cut the salaries of almost all of the staff. Many submitted their resignation letters almost the same day. Those who remained didn't mind quitting either, but the lack of other immediate options forced them to endure the antics of the tyrant. Almost half of the staff was now gone. Nate explained that some of the positions were useless and repetitive. Those who stayed ended up getting twice as much workload. As a result, they had to stay up late sometimes. His antics reached even the janitor lady, who wasn't getting paid much to begin with, so even she quit her job. So the biggest problem was finding a replacement for her. For pennies, no one wanted to mop the floors all day and rub the door handles till they shine. The HR manager, Mrs. Bennett, tried every day to convince Nate to add at least a little to the salary of the janitor, saying that for that kind of pay, they would never find an employee. So every morning, during the staff meeting, all Nate did was complain how dirty and dusty it was in the whole office. Office was indeed getting pretty dirty by this time. It was during one of these morning meetings when Nate complained about every single thing that was going on in the office. Everybody was dumbfounded because this branch of the company was functioning perfectly fine. After going over the weekly reports, Nate turned his attention to the problem of the janitor position. "If you don't find a janitor soon, I'll have to include cleaning in your direct duties," he almost shouted to the HR manager. She was ready to run anywhere from this freak of a saver, but she knew that at her age, it was not so easy to find a job. Therefore, every time Nate brought this up, she just silently listened to his unreasonable approaches and demands, washing it all down later in her office with anti-anxiety pills. At the next such morning meeting, the manager once again expressed his dissatisfaction with Mrs. Bennett's work, saying that the janitor had still not been found. "Is it really that difficult to find a cleaner? I mean, we're so successful that anybody would be willing to work in a stable company," Nate said angrily, slowly approaching the window. At some point, he silently froze and just stayed there, staring out the window. His gaze seemed to focus on something in the distance. At the garbage cans, a very poorly dressed woman was neatly stacking cardboard boxes. Nate started smiling slyly. He turned to Mrs. Bennett and said, "So you're saying no one wants to join our company for that pay, huh? Watch and learn, rookies." He opened the window wide since it was pretty warm outside. "Hey, tramp, come in for a minute. I got an offer you might want to hear," Nate shouted. But the girl did not stop her work even for a second and just continued to fold the cardboards. The boss was surprised, but he was not going to back down. There was even some excitement in his eyes. "Hey, you need some cash? Get over here, tramp," he shouted again. But the girl kept working. That irritated the boss a little, and he turned to Mrs. Bennett to get him the security guard. When the security guard came running in the conference room, Nate told him, "Get that bum by the dump over here. ASAP," he said to the guy in the uniform. A few minutes later, the girl entered the office. After a few failed attempts to speak with her, it became clear that she was completely deaf. She seemed to have a hearing aid, but apparently it wasn't working properly, or it was just a cheap one. The beggar looked about 30 years old. Surprisingly, up close, she was a very neat girl. Her hands were clean, as were clothes and hair. The absence of makeup made her face even younger and lighter. Her hair was neatly combed and collected in a bun. Her clothes looked poor, but clean. Although the size of her clothes didn't really fit her, at least it didn't smell. The boss, apparently remembering that the deaf people can read lips, began pronouncing each syllable slowly. "Do you understand what I am saying?" The girl nodded. "Do you want a job? You do not have to do much. You'll be just cleaning the office," finished the boss. The girl stood there silently for a couple of minutes, looking around. Then she nodded in agreement, which made Nate rise in victory. He was so proud of himself. He turned to Mrs. Bennet, who was quietly watching what was happening. "Can't find a cleaning lady? Perhaps you just forgot how to hire people? Well, here's a lesson for you. That worthless piece of crap was ready even for a smaller salary. By the way, before you announce it to her, think about cutting it down a little bit maybe." But when he saw Mrs. Bennet's look, he realized he was pushing it down too much, and even the homeless girl would run away for that kind of pay. So he dropped the idea. The deaf girl started working. Her name was Lauren, and she always came to the office on time. Sometimes even long before the start of the working day. She diligently washed, cleaned, and wiped everything that she came across. In just a week, the office was unrecognizable. But that did not improve the team's attitude towards the deaf colleague, who was often the target of cruel and teasing jokes. The colleagues would make fun of her behind her back and laugh so hard, knowing that she couldn't hear them. The girl's hearing aid was of low quality and old, yet she could still hear some of the nasty things people told about her and her work. Despite the constant harassment, she had been through a lot in life and was able to maintain her composure. She always looked forward to leaving work and returning to her peaceful home on the outskirts of the town where she lived in an old and abandoned shack. Lauren was not alone in her small home. She had taken in several stray pets, including 3 kittens, a cat, 2 dogs, and a parrot with a broken paw. These animals were her constant companions, and she was willing to endure the teasing and ridicule at work in order to provide for them. Her pets were her source of comfort and love, and their presence helped her to cope with the daily abuse at work. At night, while she may have only bread and water for herself, she would always make sure to have something delicious for her furry friends, as their loving glances were enough to make up for a hard day's work. Mrs. Bennet was extremely pleased with the cleaning lady, whose work kept the office spotless, despite the fact that her colleagues continued to mock her behind her back. And the manager, Nate, he still remained unimpressed with her work. He couldn't quite put his finger on what he wanted from her, but over time, the girl's silent demeanor and intelligent eyes began to earn her the respect of her colleagues. Even those who had previously made fun of Lauren began to realize that her past was not as simple as they thought. Despite being a beggar, she was well-spoken and literate. Her speech was brief but insightful. Her colleagues were often taken aback by her clever and thought-provoking remarks, giving the impression that she had a deep understanding of many things, but just chose not to reveal it. It became clear to them that her current situation was not a reflection of her intelligence or abilities. The office atmosphere had become tense and stressful, with Nate the boss displaying aggressive behavior every morning during the meetings. He seemed to blame others for the company's poor performance, which had begun to decline dramatically. As a result of this decline, the boss, who had become increasingly bitter, began to let go of employees on a regular basis, often firing multiple people at once. This only added to the negative atmosphere and uncertainty among the remaining employees. Rumors were circulating among the co-workers that Nate the boss would soon be the only one left in the office. The company's owner and CEO, Nolan, had begun visiting more frequently, likely due to the branch's sudden decline in profits. However, Nate would use this as an opportunity to intimidate and pressure the employees to create a positive image for Nolan during his visits. Despite Nate's efforts, Nolan, who had built the company from the ground up, was not going to let it fail and would take action to turn things around. After several visits to what was once one of his successful branches, Nolan noticed that while the office appeared to be functioning well on the surface, there was a sense of unease among the employees. After another visit, Nolan announced that the company was undergoing a thorough cleaning process and that all employees, including the manager, would be given a paid day off. Anyone who refused would still be paid. While everyone was away, Nolan had installed hidden cameras throughout the office, which were connected to his personal computer. He wanted to uncover the truth about what was really happening in the office and take action to salvage the business he had built through hard work. Nolan dedicated himself to monitoring the office every day, from the time it opened until it closed. He meticulously gathered information and evidence to understand the reasons behind the branch's decline. One day during a meeting, Nolan was presented with a well-crafted business development plan that caught him off guard. He quickly read through the material and looked up at Nate in surprise. "What is this?" Nolan asked Nate, holding up the business plan. "Who prepared it?" Nate realized that Nolan was intrigued by the material and modestly lowered his gaze, replying, "I worked very hard on it, sir. I didn't sleep for several nights. I really hope you like it." The first thing that struck Nolan as odd was the neat feminine handwriting. He had read multiple reports written by Nick, so he was familiar with his scrawled handwriting. His further investigation gave him more clues that Nate's mind was as convoluted and erratic as his handwriting. Nolan viewed the recorded videos and was shocked to discover that the cleaning lady had spent a significant amount of time working on the papers late into the night. She was completely focused and engrossed in her work, not even keeping track of the time. She was also able to create graphs and diagrams so easily as if she had been doing it for years. Nolan was upset that he overlooked so many things at his branch. The next morning, Nate was summoned to Nolan's office. He came rushing in, but as soon as he saw the expression on Nolan's face, he suddenly stopped. He stood there looking down on the ground as Nolan scolded him. Everyone in the office was too afraid to speak or move, fearing the boss's wrath. "Do you realize that your deceit and deception nearly destroyed the branch?" Nolan started furiously. "I am just astounded at the number of high-class employees I've lost due to your arrogant behavior. You fired all of the best workers that I've been working hard to handpick for so long." "Nolan, let me explain." "I don't need your explanation. I was like, okay, I guess Nate's probably testing some kind of technique, but when you attempted to take credit for someone else's work, that was the last straw." Nolan calmed down, sighed, and said, "You have 10 minutes to get your stuff and leave." The once confident manager suddenly appeared defeated and lost color in his face as he made his way towards the exit. At that moment, he heard Nolan ask the secretary to bring in the cleaning lady, a young woman named Lauren, who was deaf. As soon as Lauren silently entered the office, Nolan gestured for her to sit down. "Please, take a seat. I want to know more about you. Obviously, you're intelligent and have not been disadvantaged all your life." Nolan began the conversation. The girl, a bit confused, confirmed that this was the case. As she started speaking, Nolan realized that despite her deafness, she was not dim-witted. She looked out the window as she spoke softly and began to share her story. Lauren grew up in a very poor family, but from a young age, she had a love for learning new things. Despite the difficult circumstances of her household, where her parents would drink heavily and engage in drunken fights at night, she worked hard on her studies. From the third grade until she graduated, she would seek refuge in an abandoned house near her apartment and would study there on the days her parents were drinking. In the morning, she would slip back home quietly to grab her clothes in the backpack while her family was still asleep and would rush to school. Despite the challenging circumstances, Lauren managed to excel in her studies and had no difficulties getting accepted into a business school. She was a smart and determined student who was well liked by all her teachers. She had a natural ability to understand concepts so quickly and was always willing to assist her classmates. It came as no surprise to anyone that Lauren graduated with the highest GPA. Business administration was her favorite subject and her lifelong aspiration. It was there where she first met her first love, Connor, who was a year older. As soon as they saw each other in the university's hallway, they knew they had fallen in love. However, Connor's wealthy family disapproved of their relationship, particularly the idea of their son marrying a smart but financially challenged woman. Despite this, their love was so strong that Connor proposed to Lauren, expressing that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. Lauren and her fiancé, Connor, went to visit her friends outside the city one day. They were in high spirits, especially since they were due to get married in a week. They were getting close to their friend's country house, where everyone was already waiting for them, when a dense fog descended suddenly. Everything around them was white and hazy. They didn't even realize when the headlights of an oncoming car shone right into their windshield. A terrible screech of brakes, a crash. When Lauren regained consciousness, she was already in an ambulance. The first thing Lauren asked about was her fiancé's well-being. She fainted upon learning that he had passed away. When she woke up in the hospital room, Lauren immediately realized that something had changed in her life. From that moment on, she became deaf. The doctors were unable to explain the sudden loss of hearing and attributed it to stress. Despite her hearing loss and difficult mental state, she pleaded with the doctors to allow her to attend her lover's funeral, but she was denied even the chance to visit his grave. Connor's parents blamed her for the accident and claimed that if it weren't for her and her broke friends, he wouldn't have gone to the country house. In the end, almost launching at her with her fists, Connor's mother literally hissed, "Bitch, I will make your life miserable. You can only get a job as a janitor at best. You will cry regretting that you ruined my son." The only thing that the poor girl regretted at that moment was that she didn't die instead of Connor. After all, no one needed her anyway. Her mom changed roommates like gloves and soon managed to burn down their house when she was having drinking sprees with another one of them. Her life was full of no's. No job, no home, no love, and now no hearing. It was impossible to get a job. No one was interested in a deaf, fragile beggar. In the beginning, she taught herself how to read lips. After some time, she managed to earn a bit of extra money by cleaning at the local market. She spent that money on a cheap hearing aid. It didn't restore her hearing completely, but it allowed her to hear some words. From then on, she started to just wander around. She found a small shed where she could take shelter. Despite her difficult circumstances, she never complained about her life because she had already seen so much unfairness. She was content with her beloved pets, who were her closest companions. The only problem was that when the weather turned cold, her pets would freeze since the room in the abandoned house was not heated. Even at that moment, she was worried about her pet's well-being. Nolan sat there, quietly listening to her sad story. At the end of the story, he remembered the tragic accident involving Connor. He knew his rich parents and was saddened by what happened. That same day, he offered Lauren, a highly qualified business graduate, to become the new executive director of the branch. And when she agreed, He was very satisfied with the decision. The branch improved rapidly. Nolan visited the branch frequently. Sometimes he was even seen picking up Lauren from work. At some point, everyone knew they were dating, and eventually, the news of their marriage became known to everyone. Nolan made her a perfect gift. One day, he dropped by the branch after lunch. He knocked on Laura's office, and when he entered, he saw that she was all consumed as usual. "Honey, take a break, will ya? I got you something." In his hands was a certificate making her the owner of an animal shelter where all her pets were residing. As she settled into her new home with her husband, she would not have the time to take care of them in the foreseeable future. On top of everything, she was excitedly preparing for the arrival of a baby boy. When Nolan heard the news, he was overjoyed. There's one more miracle that happened in Lauren's life that even doctors couldn't explain. Her hearing suddenly returned as if it was never gone, making her fully functional. The large and spacious house of the businessman was now filled with the warmth and comfort of a home. What are your thoughts on the story and characters? How would you handle things differently? Share your thoughts as they may be helpful for those experiencing difficult times. If you enjoyed the story, please consider liking and subscribing for more content. Click the notification bell button. Thank you, and